You're listening to the MindPod Network. Friends and travelers, you can support the It's All Happening podcast by heading on over to zachleary.com and using the Amazon portal to buy your stuff, or head on over to iTunes and leave this podcast a review. It's all happening. 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 It's all Welcome to the podcast, episode 117 of the It's All Happening with Zach Leary podcast. That is me, your host. So happy to be hanging out in cyberspace with you, my audible friends, lovers, and oral community. Love you guys. This week on the podcast, we have our third time return guest. He's been on 2 previous episodes, and it is Jason Louv, who is going to be talking about his book, John Dee and the Empire of Angels. Previously, Jason appeared on the podcast, one, to talk about his expertise around the occult and magic, and the second time was around the election of Donald Trump, and he came on the show the night after the election. And this time we're returning to Jason's roots and expertise in magic and the occult, but specifically focusing on John Dee, who is an incredible figure. He was Queen Elizabeth I's court advisor and astrologer, and he was the foremost scientific genius of the 16th century. Really a fascinating character, and we'll get more into the book in a minute. But first, I wanted to talk about something that we haven't really dug into in quite a while, and that is the presidency of Donald Trump. I know. Very much of a downer to talk about it. Not a very popular subject. Or is it a popular subject? And the reason that I posed that question rather, is because I was inspired by all of the chatter and discourse and kind of inherent tension around the implications brought up in James Comey's new book, A Higher Loyalty. James Comey, of course, was the former director of the FBI who was fired very early on in the Trump administration for many reasons known, some unknown. But Trump said it was most likely for the handling of Hillary Clinton's emails. But all sorts of things go on in this book, and we don't have to pick apart the book. Many other people are doing that in much more depth and perhaps much more knowledge and maybe even interest than I have. But what is very puzzling about all this is even after all of these books come out, all of these revelations are made, and Trump's lawyer being raided, his residence and office being raided by the FBI, and the allegations about Stormy Daniels, the former prostitute who probably was paid off by Trump, and all of these various things, Trump still maintains a 40% approval rating, about 41.8% if you take all of the different sources and aggregate them into an average. The point being is, if you take that number and put it in the corner and just step away from it for a second, bear witness to it, and consider the implications, certainly the implications within my own universe are that that number is so much higher than I would expect it to be, because nobody in my ecosystem in my social circle or my day-to-day life interaction circle is a Trump supporter. And in fact, most social encounters I have, the topic usually comes up, and it is usually one of outrage in a more dramatic flavor, or even and some take a more analytical tone in trying to pick it apart. 1 in 3 people, a little bit more, 1 in 3.5 people in this country support Donald Trump and his administration and everything that he represents. So that aside, and kind of looking at the division, and, obviously we are all aware of the divisive nature of politics and media and the polarization of the narrative that has made up our democratic process, and whether or not you feel it is an interesting topic or if you feel it is just, all completely a waste of time. No matter. What is so alarming to me is that our relationship with truth has become so distorted. And Jason talks a little bit about this in the podcast. We always lived in a world and within the zeitgeist and narrative of the political process. There were always some fundamental truths. And the notion that 41.8% of the American population really doesn't care about the truth, has no opinion on it one way or the other. Some people, of course, believe he's not telling lies and he is telling the truth, but there's a huge segment of that 41.8% that knows he's lying, that knows he makes up stuff as he goes along, and appeals to the lowest common brain cell denominator, and they just don't care. That, to me, is the issue. Jason Louv returns to the podcast to talk about his book, John Dee and the Empire of Angels, Enochian Magick and the Occult Roots of the Modern World. Honestly, I didn't know much about John Dee before I read the book. I just knew a very sort of passive sound bite that he was one of Queen Elizabeth's court advisors, and he was somewhat controversial because he was into the occult and magic and things like this. So, but after reading the book, I learned so much more and really got to understand the importance of his role and his accomplishments in how the history of England proceeded after, certainly after his death, but after Queen Elizabeth's reign, and the influence that he had within that, and why it was so, just so important. He really helped to elevate England to become one of the foremost imperial powers in the world, centuries ahead of his time. His theoretical work included the concept of light speed and prototypes for telescopes and solar panels, and he was actually given the name, his crown-given moniker, 007. And that's where Ian Fleming took that from. Very interesting, right? So the book is on sale now. You can go to johnd007.com or go to Amazon and buy a copy. And it's very, very, very much worth it. It's a fantastic tale. It's also a fantastic history lesson as well. You'll learn so much about the formation of the modern world, even as it stands now. So Jason Louv, here we go. Jason, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me back, Zach.
Yes.
Yes, it's good to be back.
This is I think you're I know. I don't think you're the first third-time guest.
Oh,
That's exciting.
I'm super honored. Thank you. Hopefully, I guess I've been entertaining. Hopefully.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I remember last time you came was right after the election, and we were commiserating about how did this happen.
Oh man, yeah. I actually just listened to that episode again the other day. It was, man.
How did we get here?
Yeah, crazy times.
And this time the topic is, I mean, of course, as podcasts do, we can drift off into wherever it goes, but the topic is a little bit more focused. You have a new book out called John Dee and the Empire of Angels. You know, I knew who John Dee was very superficially. I knew a little bit about the occult roots and his relationship with Queen Elizabeth. He was kind of the Rasputin for Queen Elizabeth, sort of. But I didn't know anything about him. And reading your book, it really, not only did I learn so much about him, but I also learned so much about the culture of England at the time and how that carried over into the modern age. So but I want to start at the beginning. Who is John Dee?
Okay. Maybe we should start even earlier than that. So, So my overwhelming theme in my life, the thing that I've been trying to do for the last 20 years, is bring out the Western esoteric tradition, which is sometimes called the Western occult tradition or the Western magical tradition. And people are very familiar with, we have so many spiritual paths that are available now, Tibetan Buddhism or Hinduism or Sufism. There are all these things that people are aware, yoga, there are all these things that people are aware of. But there's also this kind of other thing that's been lurking around, or I would say in the shadows, not in a dark way, but has just been kind of hidden, which is the Western occult tradition, which is really has been the secret spiritual tradition in the West that has had a massive effect on Western history and the progress of things like the creation of the British Empire, the American Empire. But it's been a truly occult tradition in the sense of hidden. Mm-hmm. And it's had all these negative things associated with it, like, the idea of Satanism or the negative publicity around Aleister Crowley, or people have had, weird ideas about it. Or even if you go back to the 80s, there was such a panic around D&D and the occult and all this stuff, Right. So it's kind of been...
I forgot about that. Yeah, our kids are playing with Dungeons and Dragons.
Right.
They're Satan worshippers.
Although, to be fair, in retrospect, it was kind of true because I played a lot of D&D and this is how I ended up. So, so you got to give them that. But it's been... the redheaded stepchild of the spiritual world in a way. And it's something that I've been, obsessively researching, both in a journalistic and in a practical sense, for 2 decades now. And I think that it is a truly, perhaps one of the most profound and in many cases effective spiritual paths in the world. However, it has been hidden and reserved for, I would say, an elite subset of society who have had in the past the information and have jealously kept it to themselves. And that doesn't necessarily just mean political or economic elites. It also means small groups of people in secret societies who've sat on the information and kept it behind closed doors. So, as one of my primary spiritual teachers was Genesis Peorage from Throbbing Gristle and Psychic TV, and Jen really started the process of saying, no, this information needs to be out to the public, and that's something that I've carried on. And so the reason that I became interested in John Dee, who, yes, is a figure from the 16th century. He was the scientific advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, and really one of the people to formulate this tradition, is that I think that he's probably the central figure of the whole thing, and certainly one of the most intelligent and scientifically rigorous people to ever approach the idea of esotericism or the occult. So John Dee was, I wouldn't say he wasn't quite a scientist, but he was one of the proto-scientists in that he was the person that laid the groundwork for the scientific tradition to occur in England in the 16th century. prior to, this was before the scientific method had been developed. It was before Francis Bacon.
Like for Isaac Newton to be able to exist, John Dee had to exist.
Exactly.
Okay.
But what he did was bring the scientific and intellectual knowledge of Europe to England during the Protestant Reformation, at a time when there was the most, I mean, this is almost crazy to think about now, the extent of the information they had access to in England at that time was at Cambridge and Oxford, and both of those universities had around 400 to 500 books total. John Dee had 2,500 books and manuscripts at his house in Mortlake in southwest London, and he was a comprehensive thinker. He was a guy who knew optics, mathematics, geography, astrology, astronomy, naval science. Wow. He was a true Renaissance man in the sense that he was alive at a time where it was still possible to know everything, or at least know everything that had been written down by humans, right? So he was really the foremost intellectual genius of England at this time. He's comparable to somebody like Da Vinci. And he was a government servant, and actually was one of the first people to start the British intelligence. He was there at the beginning of the English intelligence agencies, in which his code name was 007, which is where that comes from. That's where Ian Fleming got that. So he created the British Intelligence Society services. He laid the groundwork for science. He was the first person to bring knowledge of geometry and higher mathematics to the British public by writing an introduction to Euclid. He was the person who came up with the phrase the British Empire and told Elizabeth that there should be a British Empire, and that England could dominate the planet by using naval power in the same way that the Romans had used roads, and then gave her all the optical information and geographical information for how to do that, for how to build a navy. And that was just the first half of his life. So, and then on top of that, he then spent 10 years using all of his accumulated scientific knowledge to try to attempt to contact angels, because he felt he had exhausted everything that was possible to learn from people in books, and now he would have to talk to angels to get.
He had to go within or without, right?
Straight to the top.
Straight to the top. But how does somebody like that in 16th century England amass, I mean, when was Gutenberg's Bible? What year was that?
Good question. I'm slightly embarrassed for not knowing this. It was around. Yeah. I think it was around this time.
Yeah, just maybe like 100 years before or something.
I don't think even that.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't think even that, because I know that at this time the only. Yeah, there was only one. It was before the King James Bible, which was when the Bible was first really mass published to the public.
So, I mean, but my point of me saying that was, Gutenberg's, the press and making the King James Bible was the first way to mass produce, a book, and so not a short time afterwards. I mean, how does someone like this accumulate 2,500 books at that time, and like, where did that interest get sparked, and where did he come from? What was his intention or passion or inspiration to go down that road?
So Dee was born in a mercantile family, so middle class family. But his father was, a servant to the king in a certain capacity. Right. So he was recognized as a mathematical genius at a very early age. He studied at Cambridge, and so he went through the English school system. But he was a STEM student, right, as we might acknowledge now. At the time, the intellectual climate in England was humanism, which is like soft sciences. Right. The whole intellectual climate at this time was that they had just recovered after the fall of Constantinople. They had just recovered for the very first time in Europe the manuscripts of Aristotle and Plato and Greece. And so everyone in the academic world was obsessed with the idea of what was called humanism, and they were just trying to understand what was known in Greece and Rome and bring back the study of the classics. So they were not at all in this idea of that there could be an experimental science to actually learn things from the world. They were like, well, the Greeks and Romans must have had it figured out, so let's just study what they knew.
Oh, right. Okay.
So to answer your question, Dee he was interested in mathematics. He was interested in hard sciences. He was a STEM kid, right? But also the occult, which at that time was just seen as part of the academic world. It was the idea of Hermeticism was seen as, really the idea was that by studying things like mathematics or optics or astrology or astronomy, what people were really doing was studying God. They were studying, they're studying the world. So if you study the world, then you understand how God created it, and you can maybe even see the signature of the creator in the creation.
His signature could be encoded throughout those practices, throughout those sciences.
Exactly. Basically. I mean, mathematics.
Right. Mathematics, right.
And constant numbers, pi. Why are there constants? The Fibonacci sequence, things like this. Right. This is one of the things they were interested in. And so Dee was interested in this, and in order to learn more, he had to go to the University of Louvain in no relation to my last name, in the Netherlands. So he had to go to Europe where they were all studying this stuff. And so what he ended up doing is bringing back, as you might say, the STEM fields to England. So
at that time when John Dee was a young man, what was the state of, the occult, I guess, occult culture? I don't know if those words go together, but what was the state of people practicing what we now refer to as the occult, philosophy or methodology or actual ceremonies, practices? And did they refer to it as that back then?
So, do you know Ken Wilber?
Yeah.
Okay, so I actually think so when we talk about the occult, it's such a minefield, right? Because there's, on one hand, people have all these negative connotations like voodoo dolls and Satan and Led Zeppelin videos, Marilyn Manson, and then on the other hand. Right. But when we look at people like John Dee, they're looking at it as something like mathematics or physics, as some type of higher wisdom that could be gleaned. That is a split. When we look at the occult, we see both the best and the worst. Right. We see, on one hand, people looking for very childish type rituals to get their way or to hurt somebody, which we might think of as like a developmentally challenged person trying to do things that don't make sense and are not scientific. And on the other hand, we have people who are at the very heights of intellectual, who are really looking at the universe in like a Vedantic way or a Vajrayana way, where they're saying the universe is obviously a cohesive whole, right, and there are obviously hidden laws that we need to understand what the universe is. Hidden laws and
in Vedanta refer maybe as subtle laws,
sure,
the subtle universe.
Yeah, right. Very well, exactly. Yeah. And so we have these two things uncomfortably coexisting side by side, kind of like a developmentally challenged way of looking at the universe and a very developmentally advanced way of looking at the universe, which are both might be considered magical thinking in a way, coexisting. And that's a weird thing that happens in their time period and is the same way now. So Ken Wilber has, I think, one of the most useful concepts that anyone has ever come up with for assessing this entire field, which he calls the pre-trans fallacy. He talks about it in, I think, one of his gigantic and very lengthy books. I think Sex Ecology and Spirituality, he talks about it. And basically what he says in that is that, Ken Wilber looks at human individuals and human cultures as progressing through stages of intellectual development. And he says that when you look at pre-modern cultures, you see cultures that pass through the animistic magical stage, where they think, where they're engaged in just pure shamanism and thinking about, what we might recognize as tribal shamanism or
calling to spirits.
Exactly. Trying to make it rain, dowsing rods, that type of thing. And that those cultures usually progress from there into what he calls the mythic stage, which is a more priest class type religion, where it's like, this is what reality is, but they're believing that, Jehovah, the vengeful god, is literally real, or that, the Hindu gods are literally real and they must be propitiated or bad things will happen, so on and so forth. And then he says that people kind of progress from that through, the scientific stages, through modernism, into postmodernism and relative ways of looking at the world. And then, at least in his model, he says that people tend to advance past postmodernism towards a holistic way of viewing the world, where and really he's drawing on Vedanta and Vajrayana Buddhism for this, where he's saying that, people progress from postmodernism into seeing the universe as not only inherently interconnected on all levels, but inherently empty, as the Buddhists would say,
right.
and seeing that the whole universe is a coherent whole and one system, and that all previous developmental stages have a perfect place in this, and that everything is perfect, and that everyone is inherently connected to the entire universe. Right, which I'm sure many of your listeners will be totally on board with, right? So what he says is, so what we have here, but again, like that mode of thinking, which is what we might, broadly call enlightened thinking, right? How an enlightened person sees the world, also looks like magical thinking. So he says that the pre-trans fallacy is when we have people in the scientific, modern, or postmodern stages of development who are in between these two things. We'll look at pre-rational, like let's take, like a Christopher Hitchens type, right?
Right.
Would look at, and I love Christopher Hitchens, right? But he
of course you do.
He's brilliant. But you take somebody from
I hung out with him once, which I'll tell you about sometime.
Oh, that sounds like a story.
That's cool.
But you take somebody who's a pure materialist, even Marxist, or postmodern, or just any type of hardcore scientific materialist, would look at something like shamanism or the New Age or astrology or all these things and look at it and say, this is pseudoscience. It's pre-rational. It's not intelligent. People have not developed. It's like, this is silliness. They've totally dismissed it. And they would also look at something like Vedanta or Vajrayana Buddhism or Hermeticism, as I argue in this book, or any of these worldviews that we might consider more enlightened consciousness, and not be able to distinguish between those two things.
Right.
And that's the pre-trans fallacy. So they're looking at pre-rational and trans-rational and confusing them as the same thing. And Wilber's argument is that the issue with our culture is we're stuck in the middle and can't distinguish which way we're headed, and that this causes all types of confusion. And I think this is actually a good way to look at Dee, because with Dee, I think we can argue that he's a enlightened trans-rational thinker.
Who's also into magic.
Well, he's also into magic, and he's existing in this cultural context in England where people are doing all these crazy, voodoo-like practices, where people are constantly,
But it's weird because I think of myself as someone who kind of hovers in that middle space.
Right. Well, I think we all do, right? I think anyone interested in this hovers between those.
Right. Yeah. But someone like Christopher Hitchens definitely does not.
Right.
He firmly is on one side of the fence. But I just think any sort of affiliation or attachment to mysticism, any experiential, your own personal, individual experiential relationship with mysticism will induce some sort of, quality within your perception of the world, where it's like, oh, wow, well, maybe some of it is magical thinking, and I can't quite explain it. But that's what's so interesting about what I loved so much about your book, is that he does his best to explain it. Right. Right, which is a lot you're born in love with through math and all these things that you're talking about, which is sort of an aspect of the occult, at least the roots of the occult, which I didn't really know or understand, is that it was this methodology for trying to explain this middle ground.
Right. Well, it's actually very simple if you see it in context, which is that Dee's period and the time in which Hermetic thinking, at the time it was called Hermeticism.
Right.
What that really was is they were just trying to understand the universe.
Right.
It's really that simple. And this was before...
This is before Galileo.
Right.
Yeah.
It's before science made a distinction of this is mysticism and this is science. It was before there were boundaries between any intellectual disciplines.
This is before Galileo. That's an important point, I think, in the relationship with the planets and the universe, right? They're just still trying to figure it out.
It's actually, the Copernicus had just happened.
That just happened, right.
So they had just figured out that everyone was circling the sun, but this was only the intellectual elite were aware of this.
Right. It was
because they figured if they told the masses, they would freak out and revolt, which they may have,
Which I'm just going to lead me to our next segue in this. But Hermeticism in England in the 16th century, what were these practices? What were people doing?
So Hermeticism,
a few times. What was going on?
So Hermeticism is really a philosophy, which we've just discussed, and really all it is saying that. And by the way, anyone who's ever done psychedelics, this will make perfect sense to. Basically,
everyone who listens to this podcast.
Okay, so like if you've ever been tripping in nature, then you understand Hermeticism perfectly, right? And really, Hermeticism is just saying the universe is one thing; it is intelligent, and that it is all interconnected, and that everything is similar on different levels of magnitude. So that, for instance, if you look at a leaf and you stare at a leaf and you understand all the intricate ways that it's constructed, well, then maybe you understand more of, the universe is constructed in the same way, right?
And when you take a DMT trip and have those DMT sort of sacred geometry visions, they're very much like the leaf you just looked at.
Exactly. Right. Or you look at, your eye, and then you look at, a nebula that looks exactly like your eye. Well, as above, so below, as the Hermeticists say. So Hermeticism is really a philosophy of understanding how everything in the universe is a hologram. Meaning, obviously, if you take a physical hologram and cut it up, all the smaller pieces will contain the entire hologram. Right, that's how Hermeticists see the world. That everything is one thing and similar on all levels. Operative magic, was at this point an even more underground tradition than Hermeticism, and was really the experimental wing of Hermeticism. And what operative magic was the idea that, well, if everything is similar and connected, then can we exploit this to cause things to happen? For instance, what's an example? If a red gemstone is similar to the planet Mars, then does that gemstone in itself inherently contain the energy of Mars, which is aggression and warfare? And then if you give it to somebody, will it cause that energy? And so we can see we can see the kind of degenerated version of that in the modern New Age. But really what it was is, I would say, okay, this is how I put it in the book. Hermeticism was trying to understand the universe as one coherent computer, right? It's like as if the universe was a computer with an operating system trying to understand what the operating system was. Magic was trying to reprogram it.
I love that.
Or coming up with a programming language,
right.
And in fact, the main quest at this time was to discover the language, the primal language, the theorized language with which God and the angels spoke, and that was spoken by humanity before the fall of the Tower of Babel, and that this would unlock, that if anyone learned this language, they would be able to reprogram nature. So very much like a computer language, and it's only Dee that actually actualizes that quest and allegedly discovers the language, which is Enochian.
But he discovers that language, but Dee, he became a courtier, and he was part of that school who kept that language sort of in the, the upper ranks of the elite, right? So like we were just talking about Copernicus had just happened, and they realized, that Earth was not the center of the universe, but that information was kept just at the highest levels because they didn't want to scare the public. And Dee, so let's just transition into this. How did Dee hook up with Queen Elizabeth? How did that meeting happen?
Dee was definitely a courtier. He was definitely in the elite, but he was perpetually in trouble and perpetually poorly paid.
Right.
And he had, after he graduated from university in Europe, he had gone around Europe and given lectures on mathematics, and was bringing people mathematical knowledge for the first time, lectures that were packed out the gills. People were hanging out the windows to see them. He was an intellectual rock star.
He was bringing this knowledge to people for the first time in a way that there was no other access point. I mean,
right.
The books were not all that popular yet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, people wanted this information. Right. He was the place to get it, and he entertained all these offers from, all the monarchs of Europe and emperors who all offered him huge sums of money to come work for them, and he turned them all down because he was an extreme patriot. He wanted to go back to England to serve the crown. So he goes back to England, and the first thing that happens is they throw him in the Tower of London. They accuse him of sorcery and all this stuff, and he gets caught up in. Basically, at this time, it was the reign of Queen Mary, who was Elizabeth's sister, and Dee had been connected with Elizabeth and had been consulted by her on astrological charts, and it had drawn up charts for her and Mary and various other things. And this was at the time a serious offense. It was called calculating. And he was arrested and thrown in prison and probably tortured and forced to reconvert to Catholicism and publish tracts denouncing magic and turn in other heretics. And it was a pretty brutal time. But what happened was that after Mary was disposed from office, I think she died.
Yeah,
and
that's right, she died.
And Elizabeth came to power, and Elizabeth remembered Dee from doing charts for her, and gave him some minor political, gave him a minor court position, although it didn't pay him very much, but wanted to retain him as a scientific, mathematical, and astrological advisor.
And at that time, that was still some may say that today, but at that time that was a great honor. I mean, there wasn't any kind of conspiracy attached to that. I mean, being asked by the Queen of England to serve in the court was a tremendous accomplishment.
Absolutely. Right. And Dee was a true patriot, and he was a true believer in the sense that he was he was profoundly Christian. And he was profoundly and uncynically engaged his entire life in the quest, not only for knowledge, but using it for the betterment of his country. So he really was a government. He was basically a low-paid government contractor.
How did he? I mean, this is kind of a vague question, and you do get into it in the book. But how did he sort of reconcile because he was a Christian, but with sort of the level of sort of uncertainty that the occult, some of these practices can unleash.
Right.
I mean, how did he see it all working together?
He saw it as perfectly working together, but other people did not, as you might imagine.
Right.
What was happening at this time, it was right after the Protestant Reformation. And, the Luther had posted the 95 Theses, and that had been rolled over into England for political reasons. England had just Brexited essentially from the Catholic Church,
right.
and said, and really Henry VIII had said, okay, well, you won't let me get divorced, whatever, I'm going to go start my own church with blackjack and hookers, and not literally, but England had decided to create its own version of the Catholic Church, which was the Anglican Church, with the king as the head instead of the Pope, and this for people in Europe was so traumatic. And by the way, at the same time that the Copernican revolution had happened, at the same time that the printing press had started bringing the Bible to people for the first time, and people could actually read it for the first time. These were traumatic events in Europe, and they decided that it had to be the end of the world. So Dee saw this as, there was something seriously wrong in that there were now competing churches. You have to imagine a source of tremendous emotional stress for European people,
right?
To have competing sources of truth. For us now, it's like, well, we live in this world of chaos, but this was very traumatic for them.
At one point, Queen Elizabeth, she never married. Yeah, right. Never had any children, theoretically,
Well, she probably had many lovers.
Had many lovers, but some say she might have been a virgin.
Well, very unlikely. But she did. She what was happening there was that that was the PR. She was telling people she was called the Virgin Queen, and she was kind of putting out that she was a virgin because what they were looking for.
But she had many lovers, yes.
Right,
yes.
But which is documented well in Shakespeare in Love.
Yeah.
But they wanted to form some type of an alliance with another European country by marrying her to another monarch.
And they tried to in France, but he was Catholic.
Right.
And that was the rub. The court wouldn't allow it because he was Catholic.
It was a mess.
It was a mess, right? So but I mean, you were kind of like saying he was a low-level kind of government worker, but he had access to the Queen. I mean, he was performing experiments sort of in the court.
And they were very close in many ways.
Right. What kind of experiments was he performing? Like and from that, maybe tell me a little bit about the controversy that sort of erupted and why he was. I mean, not everyone wanted him around in the court, right? And
so here's the deal: the big technological arms race at this time in England and in Europe was for alchemy, right? Because people still thought that alchemy was going to work. And so it was widely believed that there had to be some secret chemical method for turning base metals into gold, right? Which is perfectly reasonable to think if you haven't figured out that that's not possible yet, at least with that technology of the time, right? So,
why did they think that was possible? Sorry to interrupt, though, because why did they think that was possible at all?
Well, because they didn't have a very advanced knowledge of chemistry, right? I mean, they would see, you see water changing states.
All right.
Why can't metals, in theory, change? You can melt metal.
Right.
Why could you not? You can alloy metal, right? Have you done metalworking at all?
Yeah, sure.
So you see all the crazy changes of state and alloys you can make. So the theory was that there had to be a way to change one metal into another because they thought that they were permutations of some underlying element. Right. Instead of having totally different molecular structures because they didn't have that level of scientific sophistication yet.
Got it. Yeah.
So they figured there had to be some way to turn base metals into gold, and whoever figured that out first would now have a source would now be economically dominant in Europe because they would have a source, they would be able to print money. Right. So if you look at the race for alchemy as kind of like the race for AI now, or blockchain or something like that, where it's like, whoever figures this out first wins. And what happened in context in European history is that they figured out that that wasn't going to happen, and then it became imperialism, right? Whoever gets the most land in the world now wins. But before that, it was alchemy. And ironically, Dee's the person who figures out that it's actually imperialism that you want. By pushing for the British Empire. But they all of the monarchs in Europe and Elizabeth were deeply interested in the occult, but only for this reason. With the caveat that they were also interested in the idea of the philosopher's stone, because they thought that it could cure diseases and help them live longer.
So only for the reason of the expansion of and the proliferation of money and imperialism, essentially. Right.
Well, yeah. I mean, they wanted gold.
Right.
And so Dee and Kelly, the psychic he later worked with, are consistently getting caught up in this, and monarchs are often trying to force them to work in alchemy or locking them up. And Dee, of course, saw alchemy as a series of metaphors for spiritual enlightenment, and he created an alchemical document called the Hieroglyphic Monad, which explains many of the secrets of alchemy, and was trying to interest Elizabeth and the Holy Roman Emperor and many other people in this document, and trying to really market himself and push himself. And he would go and talk to them and say, I have all the secrets of alchemy, I can make you enlightened. And they would say, can you give us gold? And he would say, no, it's a metaphor for spiritual enlightenment. And then they would slam the door and not talk to him anymore.
Did he know what he was doing with that and how that would sort of, carry on for the next 500 years?
Well, he absolutely knew what he was doing in constructing the symbols. But this is actually a really critical point that you bring up, right, with the occult. And this is really very crucial to understanding it. So first bit is that the unconscious is pre-linguistic. And so it speaks symbols. The unconscious mind speaks symbolese, if you will, in that symbols directly communicate with the unconscious mind.
Okay.
Which is something that Egypt was very aware of, and that's why they used hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs communicate to the unconscious mind in a way that bypass the critical and analytical functions of the conscious mind, which is why corporations use logos, right?
Right.
They can use, or religions use symbols. They can use them to talk to you directly and bypass the part of your mind that second guesses things, right? Which, if you're trying to sell somebody something, then yeah, you want to be able to do that.
And especially with religion, don't question.
Right.
Like, don't ask too many questions. Just believe. Right?
But there's also a non-cynical side of that, which is that symbols can be used in things like masonry or religions to communicate far more deeply than language. So, for instance, how do you feel looking at a beautiful devotional image of Hanuman versus reading, an academic text on Hanuman, right?
Yeah.
And so, I think this is just part of human communication. But with somebody like Dee, what you often get, and with the occult in general, this is kind of what happens, and this is why it's become so confusing for people. What you get is people who are in kind of heightened altered states of consciousness or have very advanced understandings of the universe, and they're trying to complicate or communicate very, very complicated things in symbolic form. Right. So with Dee, with the hieroglyphic monad, he boils down this entire conception of the solar system and the universe into one symbol, and then he explains what every part of the symbol is in the document. And he gets the symbols for all 7 planets in there, and astrology, and the cross, and the process of alchemy, and the equinox, and the solstices, and all these different things into one symbol. And he says that this symbol basically contains all knowledge in it. But what you have is people who are, the people who create these symbols, and you might also argue perhaps the founders of religions, the original people who come up with these things, have these profound spiritual experiences, or, you could argue a psychedelic experience or whatever, a yogic experience, whatever it might happen to be. And then they try to communicate that to people, either in textual form or in symbolic form. And then what happens is people who are totally literal start looking at that completely literally, and then they will even worship the symbol as somehow inherently holy in itself. Right. And then the next step from that is, let's break it down. We get somebody who communicates a deep truth in symbolic form. Right. Then the next level underneath that are people that understand that it means something, but they don't know what. And then they try to figure it out, and they get their conscious mind all wrapped up into it, and they start writing books, and it just becomes a total intellectual mess. And then one level below that are people that take it totally literally and think that it's somehow inherently holy. And then one level below that are people who start killing each other because they believe in different symbols. Right. And this is kind of the story of humanity.
It's the story of humanity.
The asleep killing the asleep, dreaming symbols long forgotten.
What's the ISIS symbol? What are they working with these days?
It's that whole complicated black flag.
Oh, that black flag. Yeah. That's right. The black and white flag. What does it even say? I always forget. Every time I think about it or I see it on the TV, I forget to look it up. So, Dee is... And you mentioned this earlier, the second half of his life.
Right.
When did he, at what point did he start advising Queen Elizabeth?
I believe by his late 20s.
Oh, okay. So it was that early.
Yeah, it was as soon as she ascended to the throne.
Right. Okay. So towards the latter part of his life, how did, he was communicating these ideas. He had, pretty much a big audience for communicating these ideas, and definitely made his imprint throughout, England, which, we can talk about how that disseminated into the rest of the Western world. But, by the latter part of his life, he was well known because he had this big audience, the relationship with the Queen, and when he was giving this information, he was the guy to give it.
Right.
So my question sort of, it's hard for me to find the words for it, but what formulated as a result of that? Because it's sort of like my interpretation that because he was successful, pretty much, he established something that was not as formalized before. I know you said Hermeticism existed in England at the time, and there were people doing all sorts of different practices, but it didn't have a central architecture to it. So I kind of feel like he was like a central architect for occultism for the rest of time.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Although his central contributions to the occult come after this period when he gets into the angelic, because he was interested in the ideas of the occult at this time,
yeah.
but he was only taking minor dips into actually experimenting, and he hadn't operationalized it yet. But what he did do at this time was, in regards to what you're saying, is, you know, he lived at this giant house in Mortlake, which is a suburb of southwest London, and it became the informal scientific hub of England, and people, his library was there with 2,500 books. People were just in and out of there. He was kind of like, they were all there. It was kind of like the invisible college. It was where everyone was just hanging out talking about these ideas that would be.
It was a salon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you know, all these, you know, intelligence people were there, naval people were there, and Dee at this time was engaged in a bunch of what you might consider naval startups. Where they were trying to come up with these companies like the Muscovy Company and others to finance voyages to the New World, which he did on many occasions, although it never quite went that well for him financially, unfortunately. Right. But he did send Sir Francis Drake to circumnavigate South America for the first time to look for the Northwest Passage, and he landed in Drake's Bay in San Francisco. It was the first time England got to and they kept that secret for 10 years. It was a black op. But you know, they figured out how to, because at this time they were looking for this thing called the Northwest Passage, where they thought that there must be like a large river or some way to cross through Canada get to the west side of America, and they had theorized that it was there, but instead they could never find it. Dee sent people to Nova Scotia to look for it. They couldn't find it, but then he tried the other option of sending Sir Francis Drake, who was a privateer, so not officially on crown payroll, so therefore plausibly deniable, through Catholic territory, through Spanish territory, circumnavigate South America and get it to it the hard way. Right. And so they figured out how to get to the West Coast for the first time, which was, you know, quite valuable knowledge.
But now that we know the Earth is flat, it's funny that they didn't.
Yeah, if only they'd figured that out.
If only they figured that out then.
Isn't it amazing? That's just as an aside, how has that become a thing again?
Dude, there's they just had their first convention.
Oh my God.
I saw it on a little, I don't know, Vice News or something, or something like that.
That's amazing.
And they come in, I don't know, hundreds of people went.
These are the Vice News assignments I haven't been getting because I was writing this book instead of writing for them.
If somebody's fact-checking this, it might have not been Vice News, but it was something like that, Vox or Vice News or something.
Okay.
And they went, and what I didn't know about that is that there is a guy, of course I don't remember his name, and I never will remember his name, but the Flat Earth movement is basically accredited to one guy who put it on the map, and he is their god.
Oh my God. That's it's very depressing. Carl Sagan wrote a great book called The Demon Haunted World that you probably know in 1996, where he really just lamented the flight from
intellectualism.
Yeah. And one of the things you see from this time period with Dee is to what extent the creation of science itself was a magical act, in the sense that Dee and the people inspired by him, they wanted, and they were looking around at the conditions of Europe: poverty, madness, starvation, religious persecution, people burning each other at the stake, and just being like what is wrong with people? Yeah. And they wanted to turn, I call it flicking the switch. They wanted to turn the lights on and show that people didn't have to be afraid of things that weren't real, and they didn't need to kill each other over religious ideas, and they didn't, and most of all, that people should be free from the Catholic Church to follow whatever intellectual, to really investigate the world instead of taking things on dogma. Right. And that struggle, that occult war that science was at the core of, and that things like Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry and the foundation of America were central to, all of which comes from Dee, one way or the other. That, I think, is mankind's crowning intellectual achievement. Just the idea of the Baconian method, empiricism, and then the scientific method that came after it. This is one of the best ideas that human beings have ever come up with. It's
really just under the umbrella of the Age of Enlightenment, right?
Right.
I mean, and how that extended into the New World, and Thomas Jefferson and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is straight from that stuff.
Right.
He didn't even make that up. Yeah.
These are all Rosicrucian ideals.
Yeah,
they come straight out of Dee, and they come out of the urge to A, understand the world, and B, have people become free and enlightened and be able to determine their own destiny.
Self-actualization.
Yeah, and intellectual freedom.
Right.
And we're losing it now, which is a little frightening, but that, I bring this up because people often they put science and magic as two different things, and I say no, this is not the case. It's all a continuum. The assumptions of operative magic that the universe could be manipulated along by understanding its laws, that's what becomes science.
You think we're losing it now a little bit?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah,
I do, because of the breakdown of the public commons, if you will. The breakdown of the fact that people have, just the fact that it's very hard to, we're losing the idea of truth.
right.
We're losing the idea that there are objective truths, and that people don't have the media literacy to fact check what they're reading, and this idea of fake news, and the loss of the foundations of the American project in many ways, and the flight into, just online, we see how much people are far more willing to believe narratives that make them feel good,
Right.
or that confirm their confirmation bias, that confirm their view of the world, than to look at things objectively.
That's right. Yeah. And and you said it baked in there, there are many people who have lost the ability to accept absolute truths, that there are certain absolute truths, but doing so willingly.
Right.
That's the weird part about it, is you'll talk to some of these people who are on extreme sides of, the right and the left, and they don't necessarily care.
Right.
Yeah, they know, they can see, 1 + 1 = 2 over there in the corner. That's fine, but like you said, that doesn't make me feel good or support my point. I know that's true, but fuck it.
Right.
So we're going to do this. So it's weird, because it's not and there are some people too who I agree who are, it's a failure of the American education system, no question. It used to be, a wonderful nationwide temple of knowledge where you really, you came out knowing, fundamentals of the world.
Right.
And these days it's fallen by the wayside, and certainly there are people out there who are.
And that's not the fault of the teachers.
No, it's not the fault of the teachers. No.
Teachers are our greatest.
The teachers are awesome. No, I don't mean that.
The fault of public funding and the cascade failure of many levels of public policy.
We just gave $80 billion to the military. An increase of $80 billion, none to the schools. It's just.
You look at schools, and it's for the most part a lot of teachers now live in poverty. Totally below the poverty line, and are paying for class supplies out of their own pocket,
and have other jobs.
Working other jobs. It's shameful. It's a shame for our society. But this is
so.
Yeah. But you look at somebody like Dee, and he's looking at a world of darkness and trying to bring light to it, and that, I think, is the real core of all of these things.
And doing that through methodology.
Yeah.
That was the point, I was trying to get to, and then we see through our world today, there is the absence of this methodology, and John Dee was there, and maybe, you know about it a lot more than I do. You wrote a book about it, but, maybe some of it doesn't quite add up, but he's trying.
Right.
He's trying to create theory.
Right. So here's the thing with Dee. And this is to your earlier question. This is what distinguishes him from the occult of his day and the occult of today, and really the occult in all times, is that he's looking at what we might call the subtle forces, or the spirit world, or the idea that there are hidden occult realities, or that there are angels or other beings, and trying to put that on a rational and empirical basis, and saying, can we investigate this in a precise and scientific way? And I hesitate to say the word science, because this really is a pre-scientific era, so this is a bit of a misnomer. But to put it on a rational footing, at least, And so if we look at Dee, I mean, we've described his early career, and you had mentioned that, you know, he's obviously successful, he has a great social status and all of this to some extent. And the best way to understand Dee is if you consider somebody like Stephen Hawking, who's at the height of his career, who's well recognized as a scientific genius, who is in high demand as a speaker, who you know, has the ear of monarchs, and you know, is in a position of the height of intellectual and political power that would be available to somebody of his station. Then at the age of about 50, saying, you know what, I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life to trying to, you know, do DMT and talk to aliens and seeing if they're really there, and putting it on, you know, doing it scientifically and seeing if we can put this on scientific
that's awesome.
grounds. That's Dee, right?
That's what he did,
basically,
essentially.
Yeah.
Right. The DMT of the time.
Right. Exactly. Right.
That's so cool. Oh my God. Who's the John Dee of today? Is there anyone?
Somebody asked me that. I think that
you.
I don't know if I have the scientific background. I got a D in physics or chemistry and math in high school, so I don't know if I count. Although I'm doing my best to remedy that on Khan Academy. I think that somebody compared Dee to John Lilly actually recently, which
I have to think about that one.
I think but you probably have a different perspective on that than me.
Well, I mean, the programming and metaprogramming in the human biocomputer sort of thing. But yeah, well, I guess if John Dee ascended with the angels, John Lilly ascended with the ketamine and the tank. I don't know. I don't really consider, no offense to John, may he rest in peace, but I don't consider John to be a mystic.
In what sense?
I think it's just I mean, John did not believe in God.
Okay.
In any sense of the word.
What did he just think he was seeing his brain do things?
Yes, he was a spiritual materialist, you know, kind of very much like my dad. I think that's why they sort of got along pretty well. You know, the center of the universe is in your mind.
Okay. So it was just purely reductive.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
And
but he talks about like meeting you know, alien guides and things like that in his books.
Yeah. Yeah, he does, but that's more of a psychedelic glitch in the matrix, not a spiritual or a mystic one, I don't think. Okay. Whereas McKenna, Terrence was a mystic.
So he really believed he was going for it.
He was going for it. Yeah.
Okay. What do you think? Did you see that they had different qualities of life between those two approaches?
Who, Terrence and John?
Yeah.
Different qualities of life. You mean like personally?
Yeah. Like which one was happier? That's not a leading question. I'm
probably
actually
Terrence.
curious. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I knew John when, you know, he was much older, and he was already kind of in the heavy ketamine phase. And I spent time with him when I was a kid, and, you know, in the peak of the dolphin research. And, I mean, you know, like so many people who lose their partner, when he lost Tony, his partner, that was it. He really kind of checked out and became pretty out there. Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily describe him as happy. I mean, he was content and certainly engaged in his work. But, you know, like the light in Terrence's eyes, you know, being around Terrence the few times that I was, you know, I was again pretty young, but I was around him a few times, but, you know, his presence was, you know, very locked in.
Interesting.
And it was very, you know, palpable.
But he had a big community around him too, didn't he?
Terrence?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so did John, too.
They both did?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, John's house in Malibu Canyon was always full. It was very much like, in a way, sort of like Dee's house, you know, it was kind of like a salon of scientific, you know, idea making. And, you know, you'd kind of go there, and the early isolation tanks were invented there, and, you know, the dolphin research. And, yeah,
interesting.
It's interesting.
But this is a big question because for the reason that, well, let me put it this way. Like, people always, and you can imagine I get this question a lot, right? Which is, oh, magic isn't that dangerous for X, Y, and Z reasons. You know, what, you're messing with forces that you don't understand.
Right.
Right. You know, isn't, you know, when people get, because they're conditioned by Hollywood to like have this hammer horror, interpretation of things like, and things like this, or that things are going to go horribly wrong. You're going to summon a demon or something. And, you know, it's all going to be like Hellraiser. Okay. So magic is not dangerous for the most part. Not, I won't say that 100%. There are exceptions. But the one thing that does, that can be a danger with engaging in these practices of trying to see other realities is that they become so fascinating and they become so much more interesting than the physical world in your actual life that it's kind of like you're checking out into playing video games for years on end while your life kind of falls apart a bit. It's like literally, it's like getting addicted to Xbox or something like that, where you're constantly doing, in their case, seeing astral visions by summoning angels at a scrying table, or in the case of somebody in a sensory deprivation tank doing ketamine, you know, and anyone who's done psychedelics will know that feeling of, you know, they're constantly being shown things and there's always one more thing to see. There's always one more thing to see, right? One more vision is coming down the pike. And if I can just get to that big realization, then I'll know, then I'll be enlightened. But it never quite comes. There's always one,
That's
you
right.
know,
Yes.
and that can go on for years.
Yes.
And it can take the place of, you know, clipping your nails and shaving and doing a good day's worth of work, you know, and maintaining relationships. And so I think that that's kind of can be the inherent. That can be a tricky thing to manage. And that kind of what you're saying with John Lilly, I think certainly happened with John Dee, where, Dee and Kelly spent almost a decade doing nothing but contacting angels, and while their material lives are just falling apart.
How old was he when he died?
He was, let me think about this. He was pretty old, actually.
Certainly old for the time, right?
It's probably
1527 through 1608. So, 70.
Yeah, mid-70s.
Yeah.
He had a good run.
80.
Yeah.
80.
There you go.
Wow. Well, this book, is it out? Comes out when?
The book comes out April 17th.
Okay.
And
cool. Well,
which I'm really excited about. It does mean that the first print run is going to sell out almost immediately.
Okay.
And what that really means is that it's probably going to go up in value because it's a hardcover occult book. There's a really tremendous secondhand market for occult books. So the Psychic Bible, which I did with Genesis, which you know, like people are trying to sell that on eBay for like $1,800 right now. I wish I saw that money, but I don't. You know, there really is a very fierce secondhand market with occult books. So I recommend pre-ordering it so you get yours right away. It will go up in value, and then there may actually be some gaps where they're waiting for more books to come into the warehouse. So,
well, when you guys buy your books and you see it going up in value, instead of going on eBay, let's all get together and we can have an in-person auction in a year from now.
I'm not saying it's going to go up to $1,800, but I think that it will.
Put Jason in the middle of a pentagram and put these valuable books around him.
Right.
So John Dee and the Empire of Angels out April 17th. Pre-order it. Jason, thank you.
Thank you so much, Zach.